Nice. Well, a very warm welcome to everyone. Let us start because we have packed hour prepared for you with interesting speakers and also time for Q&A. It is encouraging to see so many people online here today. We had over 500 registrations for this webinar, which, to be honest, exceeded our expectations. I'm really glad you are all here. A very warm welcome also to the speakers. I'll introduce them in a minute. But first, I'd like to explain why we as Solidaridad have decided to organize this webinar. It is my strong belief that without a living income and living wages for producers throughout the supply chain, it is impossible to tackle the main sustainability issues in sectors like cotton, textiles, palm oil, coffee, and cocoa. In all these sectors, it is really difficult to imagine how the major sustainability issues can be solved without paying higher prices. Yes, paying higher prices alone will not solve all the problems. And yes, better prices need to be complemented by sound policies from governments, both in producing and consuming countries. And yes, there can be unforeseen consequences. But no, this can never be a reason for companies to avoid discussions or not do anything about their purchasing practices and the payment of decent prices. Solidaridad is convinced that companies can take more responsibility for implementing fair purchasing practices and paying decent prices to producers, and that these efforts should be mainstreamed rather than simply relegated to niche sustainability companies. And that is why we organized the webinar here today. This can only be realized if the subject of pricing and responsible purchasing practices is taken up broadly. And it's encouraging to see many of you here today to have this discussion. Because talking about purchasing practices and prices is often avoided. It's seen as complex and also sensitive. And when it does happen, it is typically only taking place within a sector. Today, we are bringing together speakers from different sectors because I think we can learn from each other and hopefully also be inspired to take the necessary next steps. We want today's discussion to be a starting point and continue the exchange and especially the action going forward. We also want today's discussion to be about what is possible. I think we've all heard about the challenges and the obstacles. Let us discuss today about what can be done and look at a few inspiring examples of companies and initiatives that are working on changing the status quo. Next slide, please. Today, we will hear from 3 different speakers, each with a different background and different experience and expertise, but all with a long track record. Jan-Willem Molenaar is Senior Consultant at Aid Environment, a consultancy on sustainable production and trade. His work is focused on sector transformation and systems change. Duncan Pollard, from Duncan Pollard and Associates. He has 35 years of experience working in both corporate and NGOs, principally on forestry, food and agriculture. He worked for 10 years with WWF International, followed by 10 years at Nestlé, latterly as the Vice President of Sustainability and Stakeholder Engagement. And then last but not least, Jaap Reinsdorp. He's the CEO of Schijvens Corporate Fashion. Before joining Schijvens about 15 years ago, he worked for almost 20 years for a Chinese company on everything from sales to product development to also buying. Next slide, please. Then you'll see our program for today. We are gonna start with Jan-Willem, who will launch our pricing research that we published today. And then we will hear from Duncan and then from Jaap. After that, we have time for questions. During the webinar, you can type in your questions in the Q&A function. Next slide, please, because that is, I think, where we wrote that down. Yeah, so you can use the Q&A box to ask your questions. You can also upvote questions of others. The chat function, please use it if you have any technical difficulties. So with that, next slide, please, we'll go to our first speaker, Jan Willem. He will present the key findings from the research that Solidaridad commissioned and that was executed by Aid Environment and Südwind. We'll send you a link to the research after the webinar. We, by the way, will also share the slides if you're interested. You don't need to write everything down. So basically for the research, we asked Aid Environment and Südwind to look at the role of prices in global commodity value chains. But that's first. Second, also to look at the factors that drive price setting. And thirdly, to identify policy interventions that European actors can take to contribute to living income and wage outside Europe. And that is what we're going to focus on today. Jan Willem, you have 10 minutes. That is not enough to summarize the entire research. We're not asking you to do that today. What I want to ask you is to please zoom in on your conclusions and recommendations, especially for private sector actors in Europe. What can they do and what should they do, in your opinion, in relation to purchasing practices and fair pricing? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Boukje. Well, I will try to still give a good overview of the research. Next slide, please. So together with Südwind Institute, we basically try to understand what influences prices in some of the key commodities Solidaridad is working on, as well as, can you do something about it? If you look at these figures, then you see the international commodity prices of 15 years ending about 1 year ago, and you see that there is a lot of fluctuation there. What you don't see is that over time, real prices have declined in all of these commodities except for gold. This is important because periods of low prices, the volatility itself, as well as unfair trading practices like long payment terms or sudden breaches of contracts, they tend to undermine the producers' livelihoods and their ability to pay decent wages to their workers. They can also drive human rights violations and environmental resources depletion and undermine any effort to mitigate those risks. And at last, these can also undermine any alternative strategies to improve producer income, like investments in productivity and quality. Next slide. So what influences prices? And this is a big question, and we talk about different commodities, and there's a lot of variation, but still you could formulate one overall narrative. Next. So basically, prices are being driven by supply and demand and how they relate to each other. And this depends on technical innovation, the producer investment, whether consumer trends, whether there are alternatives, substitutes available both for producers as for consumers. But it's not only this. Next. Where a lot of these commodity prices are determined by supply and demand, the actual actors in the value chain, from the first buyer till the retailer, they have a lot of influence on how value and risk are being shared between these actors. So they play an important role in the price transmission, and they can deviate from existing global reference prices, for example. And often they are also responsible for why one producer gets a different price than the other one. Next. And all of these three elements, they are influenced by public policy. That can be in origin, can be in consumer countries, subsidies to producers, VAT on consumer products, trade tariffs, or price instruments. They all can influence this. Next. And to make it even more difficult, there's also the broader context that can have a very big impact, like political tensions, interest rates, commodity exchange rates. So yeah, there are many factors. They are commodity specific, and maybe per market or in time. Next slide. So the big question, of course, is how they can be influenced. I just want to briefly tell something about that. There can be things done in origin. So you can work with producers and help them to create value through quality enhancement, value addition, or marketing. And they can also be more active in price risk management. This can be physical, for example, through better inventory management or the timing of your purchases and sales as a producer, cooperative, for example. And governments, they often don't have the capability to influence global prices, but they can have a big influence on the price environment for producers. So they can introduce price discovery mechanisms like auctions or price information systems. There are many examples of where governments intervene in how margins are being distributed between, for example, between producers and exporters, minimum prices, price guarantee mechanisms. A lot of policy instruments exist. And supply management is also important because if prices go up, likely production will follow, and possibly then it's also likely prices will go down again. So there's also a role for governments to manage supply, for example, by constraining the production area or through licensing policy, production or trade quota, for example, strategic buffer stock management. There are various policy instruments there. And there are the investments in research services, infrastructure, and market image. Next slide. The key actors, one could say, are actually the value chain actors. So from first buyer till retailer. And there is a whole menu of options that companies can adopt. You could also say maybe there's a kind of different level of ambitions in the different options. So let's start at the bottom with responsible contracting. If there's traceability, if there are longer term contracts and faster payments, then a lot of the risk for users are already being reduced. And particularly in palm oil, for example, you have very successful, effective contracting and outgrower models that ensure this. There's also the next level is co-investment, that you as a company co-invest in technical assistance or social investment in the communities where you procure from. And this is already common practice in cocoa, coffee, as well as cotton. And then there's the sharing of value, premiums for quality and sustainability. Well, a lot of premium models exist, but if we talk about significant premiums, then you find them mostly in the higher value markets. And an example, it's for example, Nespresso paying quite some premiums for the coffee they procure, also in combination with co-investment in technical assistance and responsible contracting. There also now Nescafe is experimenting with cash transfers. So there are a lot of activities in smaller, high niche markets, but also in more mainstream markets already going on. Then the next level is the safety net. At the fair trade model, they have a minimum price. Right. Also in the specialty coffee, specialty cocoa, you find minimum prices. Starbucks paid producers an emergency relief payment a few years ago when prices were very low. The coffee prices were very low. So this is something that is the next level. And then let's say the top is those who basically ignore market price. And for example, Tony Chocolonely, they just have determined this is the price that farmers should receive, and that's what we're going to pay, regardless of what the price is on the world market. And now this is also being followed by other companies. You are also in specialty coffee, you see companies that have determined what the cost price is for the coffee they buy, and they add a fixed margin on that. And that is the constant price they pay to the farmers. A true pricing is maybe another mechanism that could play a role. So there's a whole menu of options that is possible, and a lot of examples already exist. Next slide. Next slide, please. Oh, one back. Yes, thanks. And then it's not just the companies alone. There's space and room for multi-stakeholder initiatives, particularly in developing joint commitments between companies, or joint standards, common standards and guidelines. For example, in the garment sector, different MSIs, multi-stakeholder initiatives, now created a common framework for responsible purchasing practices, which should be a guide for the corporate sector to adopt the practices that are developed there. In the banana, you have the living wage commitments by the Dutch retailers that have said we want to close the living wage gap with 75% in 5 years' time. And that is now also being followed in Belgium, Germany, and the UK. And these initiatives also have a role to play in data and knowledge development and sharing, where the living wage, living income benchmarks of the salary matrix are examples of this. And then finally, the role of governments in consumer countries. It is creating some mandatory regulation, but also incentives for companies to adopt responsible purchasing practices. It could be through the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, and put more emphasis on prices as being a root cause for human rights violations. Unfair trading practices, there's a guideline from the EU, and member countries are being asked to make that into regulation. In Italy, for example, companies in the food and agriculture markets already are forbidden to buy below cost price, to return unsold products, and they have to pay within 2 months. And then competition law is often an excuse not to work on prices, but there are various initiatives in Europe that create more space for this. And also here in the Netherlands, for example, there has been the call to sector actors to collaborate on sustainability and come to common agreements. And last, there's the development cooperation tool that where governments can help producer countries to invest in research, producer support, market promotion, for example, or market infrastructure. So there are a lot of instruments. I don't want to be naive that it's easy to implement them, and some may also depend on what others do. But yeah, there is really a big menu of options available for different aspects. So I would like to leave it here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jan Willem. I see the top level is ignore market prices.
Yeah.
At the end of the webinar, I will ask all our speakers after the Q&A one question: what is your call to action? I think I might know already what yours is, Jan Willem. Thank you very much. Then I would like to go to Duncan now. Duncan, I'd like to invite you to reflect on the findings that Jan Willem just shared, and also based on your experience, to elaborate on how to mainstream fair purchasing practices and decent prices. So Jan Willem shared examples which are not mainstreamed yet. So in your opinion, what is needed to take these purchasing practices and pricing practices beyond a selective group of more niche companies as we see happening today? The floor is yours. Go ahead, Duncan.
Thank you very much. And first of all, let me thank you, Solidaridad, for commissioning this report. It seems to me that there's ample academic and in fact observed evidence in the last few years that focusing upon productivity and quality is serving companies very well, but not serving farmers very well. And it's also clear from that that all of our focus, as you've said in the report, needs to be now upon the issues of low prices, price volatility, and the fairness of trading practices. So I think it's right that this report focuses upon the role of all the actors along the value chain. I agree also that the special emphasis that should be put upon downstream companies, as they have the most power in terms of determining the terms of trade and capturing most of the value. And I think you're also right to highlight the human rights approach as one way in which to address this. I would urge everyone to read this report and read beyond the summary and the conclusions. There are lots of suggestions, lots of insights, and lots of solutions throughout the whole of the text. So let me just focus, if I may, on cocoa companies, just to give us a bit of context as to where we are. I spent a couple of hours over the last couple of days looking at the websites of 3 of the big manufacturing companies and 3 of the big traders, just to understand what they're saying about this, publicly at least, and I think we have to go on what their public statements are. I'd first of all, of course, highlight that the company that's historically thought about this most, I would guess, is Mars through its Farmer Income Lab. Lots of great work that they've done and insights. And Mars itself makes a very important point that impacts are really the what we've got to go for. So it recognizes farm gate prices as well as important. And I think that there's 2 kind of caveats from looking at how Mars talks about this, which are relevant for this Solidaridad report. And that's firstly that whilst the report is about prices, a better price is not the outcome we're after. The outcome we're after is an impact on the ground for farmers and a better livelihoods. And I think it's also worth reflecting upon the fact that we may not be able to deliver better farm income only through the traded commodities that we're talking about, because of the variety of income sources that farmers have. But that's I think the only 2 caveats I'm going to put to that. Some of the things that other companies are talking about, I think probably the most advanced is probably Olam, with the way that it's talking about farmers. It's actually giving percentages of farmers achieving a living income back in 2021. I'd like to see that report updated a little bit more. Rather disappointingly, Mondelez and Cargill avoid absolutely the question of any discussion on price and living income. And also, somewhat disappointingly, in terms of showing where their ambition is on this, is that Barry Callebaut and Olam actually talk about a reference price of a reference income of $1.90 a day as absolute poverty. I think we need to set way higher ambitions than that and abolish discussions of $1.90. It's got to be way closer to 10. And my former employer Nestle also avoids any public discussion on price that I can find. Having said that, its new human rights framework and action plan on living income does give some hope for the future, although I would say they've still got some work to do, as that's not based on absolute targets at the moment. Their ambition is only to help close the living income gap, and that's a direct quote from them. They've also made any additional payments conditional upon the farmers doing things that Nestle needs to achieve its global commitments. I'm going to, if I may, also just give a little bit more context on, and a special word on, business models, because this is hinted at throughout the report, and it is backed up by other academic work that's out there. And we need to recognize that the economic model that we are living through actually means that there's little effective global oversight on global companies. They're effectively operating above national governments. And if we want governments to play their own role, then it's important that they're not undermined by the economic system itself. And I give you one example outside this context, and that's the way that net zero climate commitments are being delivered by companies, by them investing in whichever or wherever the cost is lowest. And this is undermining government's own nationally determined contributions and therefore undermining the basis for the Paris Agreement. If I bring that back then to this report, we see a similar thing highlighted, and Jan Willem has mentioned this several times, that global commodity markets are serving companies well and lowering their risk, but they're effectively breaking the link between actual costs and the conditions on the ground and the local context, whether that be issues around human rights, social issues, environmental issues, whatever you want to talk about. And that then undermines the efforts of national governments to act in the interests of their citizens. I think that gives companies another angle that they have to be considering when we're discussing human rights. So just to start to respond to your report and what could help the discourse on prices, I've highlighted human rights. I think that's absolutely one of them. Living income, and as I've said, Nestle is already starting to get there, so other companies can surely follow. I think also that the increasing importance on traceability and transparency in sourcing is important. That's clearly going to drive companies away from commodity markets and their reliance on commodity markets. And it provides the basis for building in some of the solutions that Jan Willem was talking about, like cost plus pricing mechanisms. I think also climate resilience and the fact that companies will have to start helping farmers invest more in climate resilience, drives more investment into known farmers. And that all points towards a rebalancing of the relationship from a transactional commodity market, which is what we have at the moment, to one where there's more of a true partnership between companies and farmers. I think also that stakeholders need to enlist upon investors and marketing departments. I think investors have not been mentioned so far. I think they have a role to play. They have an interest in what's happening on human rights. And I think marketing departments have the place. That's where the value of increased prices can be transferred through to the product and consumers as well. So I'd like to see more emphasis on that. And I think we also have to recognize that there is a long history in this debate. So fair trade, as highlighted in the report, is all about addressing low prices, about addressing price volatility and the fairness of trading. So, in essence, there's no great need to reinvent the wheel. We just have to improve what's already going in and improve the ambition and delivery of fair trade would be one great place to start. So I just want to finish with two things. One is to just answer the question, what does this mean for companies? And then secondly, what does this mean for stakeholders? So for companies, if you look at the way that they operate, they're providing stability on consumer prices, stability for investor dividends, and stability for management bonuses, but they're not providing stability for farmers and the prices, as Jan Willem has indicated. And so it's clear that if there's going to be a transition to decent living standards, there's going to be some disruption there, and that will need to be shared by consumers, and hence the importance of the marketing departments. It will need to be shared by management through the bonuses that they have, and the investors in terms of the margins and the dividends that they expect. I think it will have to become unacceptable for companies to buy crops and ingredients below the true cost of production. We need to be able to move away from international reference prices or export prices. And I do think that there is an intermediate role for premiums, as we've seen Nestlé's halfway there. And adopting living income as a human right, not just through the value chain actions, but also through business practices so that they're not undermining national governments. So what does this mean for stakeholders finally? Well, you know, the report conclusion says price is highly complex and sensitive. Let's not get overwhelmed by the complexity of this. Solutions are there and they're highlighted in the report. But let's not make it sensitive. Let's change it from being a sensitive subject to one that's not sensitive. And I think the way to do that is that we have to develop a common narrative about price and a logic behind this. And so I would like to see advisors and NGOs and the various platforms challenging on having a common challenge that responds to this point that consumers won't pay, or there are certain price points. You only have to wander through your local supermarket, as I do, and price points are all over the place. We have to challenge the fact that prices are only set by governments or export prices, and we have to challenge the fact that there are global commodity prices, the global commodity markets that set these prices. I think clearly there are existing solutions that we can promote. Human rights I've mentioned, you've mentioned, premiums is one, cost plus pricing, fair trade I've mentioned, and there's a small startup that I know quite well, which is called Equal Profit, which is actually starting from the presumption that if you take the current market price, how would you better distribute the profit along the value chain? Finally, I would say that in terms of a common narrative, let's not just simply talk about prices. We really rather have to talk about prices that cover the cost of production and deliver well-being for producers and workers.
Thank you, Duncan. Thank you very much. It is my role to do timekeeping, but I find it very difficult to interrupt because of the rich content of your recommendations. So thank you for that. I'm going to ask later, what is your call to action? Well, you already made a lot of different calls to action for a lot of different stakeholders during your contribution. So thank you for that. With that, we will go to our next speaker. And in the meantime, please feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A while the speakers are talking. No need to wait till the end. Also for us as moderator to select questions, it's easier if you put them in there as soon as the question comes up. Now, we're going to Jaap, last but not least, definitely. Jaap, please tell us from your company perspective, if you listen to all that was said here, the analysis and the examples, what comes to your mind? And what learnings, examples, or recommendations do you have from your experience in the textile sector that can be valuable for other sectors as well?
First of all, hi, good afternoon. First of all, transparency. I think that's one that's very important. For example, we work with an open costing towards our clients, so that will help. And just do something and not talking about it and hiding about all kinds of things. Just take action, because it can be quite simple, and not to find the correct path, but start to walk and then find the way when you are walking. That's the best thing to do. Can I start my presentation? Then I will help you in time. Okay, next slide, please. Can you do? Yeah, thank you. First, I will introduce myself. I'm Jaap Rijnsdorp, CEO of Schijvers Corporate Fashion, with clients like Albert Heijn, McDonald's, KLM, or the NS, the Dutch Railway, and I'm responsible for buying and production. I'm working for more than 35 years in the textile industry and started my career with a Hong Kong textile company, traveling in the early 90s to countries as China, Bangladesh or India, and was a part of the system where we exploited people and the planet, and that's something I'm not proud of. I cannot talk about coffee or palm oil, our researches. I just can talk about our own company and our own journey and our own values. Next slide, please. When I joined Schijvens, a corporate fashion, it's a 160 years old family company. I got the opportunity to rethink everything. And I have a lot of slides, so next slide, please. In 2010, we joined the Fair Wear Foundation, an NGO for better working conditions in Tier 1 of the textile industry. That was a start. But there were 2 points which made a change in how we operate as a company and fitted with our values as persons and as a company. Next slide, please. The first point became clear was in 2013 when we had our 150 years anniversary. And then I ask you for the next slide again. Yeah, there they are. A party was set, and of course you invite your customers for it, because if you have to celebrate something, you do that with your customers. That's a common practice. But for us, it felt strange. Yes, these customers are the reason we exist, so they should be a part of your celebration. But the same applies for the suppliers, because we could not exist without them. Please, next slide. As no customers, no business. But no suppliers, no business as well. This was the first time we understood that everything is connected. So we invited all our suppliers to join us for a week of learning, understanding each other and have fun. Next slide, please. Since then, we do that every year. This was 3 weeks ago in Morocco. We have a few days somewhere in the world to discuss open and frankly with each other topics like living wage, delivery problems, quality issues, how to manage water and energy consumption, how can we recycle, and so on. Next slide, please. And what can we learn from each other? How can we improve? To share our values as individuals and as companies. Improve together, not as individuals, but as a group. To be a team and have a lot of fun, to share and care, as sharing is caring. After all these years, I'm more and more convinced that next to sharing and caring, respect for each other and fun are the fundament of a good and successful relationship, private and especially in business. Next slide, please. Oh, please, next slide. Yeah, thank you. That was, you can go to the next slide. Yeah. The second point was in 2015 when we saw the documentary The Inconvenient Truth. It was a shock. Our work, our passion is poison for Earth. We are exploiting it. How can we still love our jobs? And what can we do about it? And there was our supply chain. They all were and are still looking for possibilities to become more sustainable. They all feel responsible. In 2016, we started to work with Gama, a recycler. They were open for our ideas and to be part of our supply chain, not just as a supplier, but as part of the supply team. Since then, the suppliers, from recycler, from garment maker, weavers and knitters and dye houses are all working together constantly to improve the quality of recycled fabrics and contents. It proves that we should work together, that all is connected. Decisions made by one has an effect on all others, that we have responsibilities towards each other. Please, next slide. Teamwork makes a dream work. It's not about what you gain in this world, but what you contribute. To make this more clear, we developed a two-way code of conduct. It's not only what we expect from suppliers, but also what can they expect from us. It's just formalizing we all know, but we sadly have forgotten. You cannot expect people to work together to give their best if there's only one-way communication or contracts. if it's only about who can gain more than the other. That's not together. And in my opinion, it is the biggest reason why so many developments take so long or even do not make it. Because how is it possible we shoot rockets into the universe, we bring people to the moon, and we are not able to pay a living wage or to recycle a t-shirt? I don't get it. Next slide, please. And everybody is part of this supply chain, from farmers via traders to factories, brands and customers, governments and NGOs, or banks and investors, but also even the people who are protesting. We are all connected. Decision taken by one has an influence on the other. You cannot withdraw from it. You're part of it. So it's not about hiding behind laws or pointing to competitors. These are all excuses. It's about your own responsibility as person, as a company. Next slide, please. I think 2 years ago, I was asked to give a small workshop about due diligence in practice. When I gave the example that we found a young boy of 14, his name is Umar, was in one of our factories, I asked them, what would we do? What should we do? And after 10 minutes, they all came up with close down the factory, stop working with the factory, give a claim to the factory, and so on. But none of them asked me, how is Umar? How is the boy? Why is he working and not in school? Nobody. All hiding behind laws and contracts. But a law or even your contract about child labor is not to give claims to suppliers. They are there to protect and help these children. Umar is the income earner of the family, so he had no choice to work. A claim for the factory will not solve his problem. It will make only more tough. And to send him away does only mean he will start working at another factory, as he has to survive. I heard in a conversation that higher prices could not be paid because this is related to cartel pricing laws. But these cartel laws are not there to prevent farmers being paid a living wage. These laws are there to protect consumers for businesses who just want to make as much possible profit. It's an excuse from companies and governments not to act. Next slide, please. So please stand up, see your opportunities, take your responsibility, and make changes. How small the step is. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Jaap. I really appreciate your hands-on contribution, where you say, just start to walk. Don't wait till it's perfect, but do it and take your responsibility, and also the part on two-way codes of conduct and two-way contracts to work on equal partnerships. Very interesting. Thank you very much. If the audience has questions about it, just type it into the chat. Because now we're moving into the Q&A part of this webinar. We already received quite a few very interesting questions. I need to select some questions. If you think others asked a really important, good question, feel free to upvote the question. That increases chances that we select them. The first question that I'm going to ask, and I think it's a question for Jan Willem, but the other speakers are definitely free to respond to it as well. The question is, are there tips, or do you have tips for sustainability professionals on how to handle the discussion around increasing prices for a specialty supply chain that will completely disturb the market? Causing wide financial impact for companies.
Yeah, well, I think this links to the call to action that I want to make. That yeah, will it disturb the market? First of all, I think there's a lot of price fluctuation already happening and that doesn't necessarily disturb the market too much. What you see is that consumers continue to buy certain products, even though prices go up, and companies continue to make profits. But of course, it is to have a sensible discussion within a company. Yeah, there are some taboos that need to be overcome, and maybe this is not specifically related to the specialty market, but first you have to accept that price is not something exogenous or that's out there. It's not a given. You can deviate from it. But you may also think in terms of product development. So move away from fast fashion, move away from products that work with the forest quality of cocoa or coffee. So think in value to the consumer, and also business models that that allow to incorporate a fair price. And that may need different approaches in terms of margin setting or KPIs on the procurement stuff. So it is a fundamental discussion, but as soon as you realize that you have a responsibility, and you can take responsibility actually, for human rights, for livelihoods, for environment, and price does influence that, then I think you have a starting point for a review of your business models and think about, well, what would we do differently? Even though maybe initially it's very scary, and there can be a lot of assumptions about possible risk.
Thank you, Jan Willem, for that. There's another question which got upvoted quite a lot, and that's a question about competition law or legislation. The question is, are there new developments that look at the use of competition law in global value chains? But maybe we can also reflect on how or whether competition law comes into play into these type of initiatives around decent prices or cost up pricing or other collective actions in this. Duncan, do you want to reflect on that?
Look, I think I'm a little bit far away from that, so I don't know whether Jan Willem, who as he did the report was able to look into that, or Jaap, who's in the thick of business at the moment, are probably better placed to answer those.
Well, I think that it's true that a lot of the initiatives that are currently taking place are focused on European markets or domestic markets, and I'm not aware of initiatives that explicitly look at global value chain, but I expect that what is now being tested, tried, the space that is being explored, could be relevant in the future for more global discussions as well. But yeah, you have then also other ports.
I get the feeling that this is again an excuse not to pay a living wage. What does it prevent you to pay a living wage? What has that to do with competition laws? It's the decision of the company who says, yes, we pay a living wage. And you can we have our price calculation, which is based on the virgin and the normal old-fashioned things. And that we show to the client, and then we said, okay, this is the living wage, and this you have to pay for a sustainable product. This is extra, but there is no margin from us on it. There's no margin from the agent on it. No more margin from the factory. So it's easy, but it's a decision you have to make as a company. It has nothing to do with laws. It's just common sense. Sorry.
No need to apologize. Yeah, thank you. There's another question which is actually about examples of where where companies undermine government goals. I think, Duncan, that is one of the things you mentioned. There's a question on this. If you could elaborate a bit on this, on what you mean, and whether you have examples of this happening.
Yeah, and maybe I can put a reference once I've finished speaking. I can put a reference into the chat that can direct people to a paper that was produced by the Stockholm Resilience Centre and Lancaster University and a few others about the role of transnational corporations and governance, and proposing 2 ways in which that may be changed. But just to go back over and repeat the example that I gave previously, is that I think if you look at net zero climate commitments at the moment, there's companies are setting global commitments, and yet the Paris Agreement is actually built up upon national government contributions, and companies are really not paying attention to that and linking their work to those nationally determined contributions. They're actually investing in places where they're going to get the biggest return or the lowest cost. So you see that best in tree planting. So many nations have got national tree planting targets, which are part of their climate commitments, but companies are not following that. They're just going to the place where it's cheapest to plant some trees, and it would be much better, therefore, if companies would report upon their climate delivery at a national level and how that is aligned with the national level. So you can then read across to what happens in cocoa or coffee or whatever, where there are commodity markets, and sitting above whatever national governments wish to do and how they wish to influence what's happening on the ground with their farmers and export prices. They're restricted because there is this global price, that reference price, which is made, which serves companies very well because it lowers their risk and gives them a certain stability and known prices in the future. But it takes away any ability of national governments to really pull the levers that they might be able to. So that was really the point I was making. But I'll put the reference in the chat. Great.
Thank you, Duncan. There's another question, and I think Jaap, it relates to what you spoke about. As someone shared that, I've heard that if a factory paid living wages to factory workers in Bangladesh, this would generate a lot of pushback from other suppliers in the region or in the area. What has your experience been on this with suppliers? And they also added, is it another excuse?
Yeah, now we are not in Bangladesh, but we are in Pakistan. And indeed, when we started with the living wage in the factory, one of his concerns was the other factories. What would they think and say to him, and that he was how do I say, destroying their market or make it difficult for them. So he was afraid for it. But nevertheless, he showed step by step, because we first started with a few people and then started bigger, that he has more work than they have. So he's fully booked, and because he has another company, Zeeman is working with them because we do that together. He has constant work from us, and he's only growing because he has clients who are committed to him, because you cannot run away, because if we run away, he has a problem. So you're committed to each other, and that's the two-way of conduct. What can they expect from us as a customer? So slowly people are learning, and the other factories are learning, maybe it's not a bad idea. So, but it's a mind change, but it can be done. But I understand that it could be an issue. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Realities on the ground. Very good. We also received, and that's the last question, really last question that we can take, and then after that I'll ask for the calls to action from our three speakers before we round off. The last question is around commodity speculation in commodity markets. Whether you have any specific examples of how global commodity markets can be governed or designed differently to basically promote decent or fair pricing. This is a big question. I'm looking for a relatively short answer. Is anyone up for that?
I think what you see that there are really interesting examples implemented within countries, and in the past there have been the big agreements between countries in cocoa and coffee, for example, and in the end they stopped to exist because of various reasons. But sometimes you hear voices that, well, we should go back to those times. I'm not sure. There are a lot of implementation challenges to that. But already within countries, there are really interesting examples where there are safeguards for producers to receive at least a certain share of the global prices, or where they are guaranteed a minimum price, and a bit more alignment between countries, like with the living income differential in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. And that's also an interesting example to follow, whether such alignment also creates a larger scale and more sustainable impact. But it's, I don't know any model that you can say, oh, this is the model, and let's do it like this.
Yeah. Thank you, Jan Willem. We got many more interesting questions from the audience, which we're unable to get to right now, but thank you very much. I really do hope that this discussion led to more questions, but also more answers. Typically, then that leads to even more questions, which is a good thing, I think. Before we round off, I would like to invite our three speakers to summarize in one or two sentences, basically sharing your opinion on what the most important next step should be in relation to implementing responsible purchasing practices and fair pricing. So basically, what is your call to action? I propose we do the same order as the presentations, just one or two sentences. Jan Willem, as last words, I start with you.
So if you're serious about livelihoods, workers, human rights and environment, then you have to take responsibility. And looking at your pricing and purchasing practices should be part of the mix of strategies that you may have to change. And available prices are not laws. You can deviate from them. But it requires to rethink maybe some of your business model, the way how you set margins, what type of products you set in the market, and also indeed the KPIs for procurement staff. It can be as simple as that, possibly. So,
thank you.
Yeah, there's a lot, and there should be more examples, more testing, more trying.
Okay, thank you, Jan Willem. Duncan?
Yeah, I just want to echo that as well, and really just emphasize that we need this common narrative and logic that challenges this conventional thinking reflected in the questions that we've had. And really, we've got to start as I said, not just talk about prices, but prices that cover the cost of production, that deliver well-being for producers and workers.
Thank you. Clear. Yeah.
Know your supply chain. Go out there, give them a hand, look them in the eyes and give your commitment. That's the thing you have to do.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for these wise words, and thank you all to all the participants as well. We will send you the report and the slides after the webinar. A recording will also be available should you wish to look back or share with your colleagues or other peers. Feel free to do so, and also feel free to reach out to us at any time here in Solidaridad if you want to continue the conversation. Thank you very much, and I'm really grateful for your contributions, Jan Willem, Duncan, and Jaap. All the best. Bye-bye.